Domine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, et Vini Sancti Spiritus Reclitorum correda fidelium, et tui amoris in signum accende, mite spiritum tuum et creabuntur.
Et renda pactis faciem cere.
Oremus Deus qui correda fidelium, Sancti Spiritus illustratione nequisti, da nobis in iodem spiritu recto sapere, et te eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sed sapientiae.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. In this new trimester, we'll be starting a new set of notes, because the work that we draw this course from is divided, in fact, into several different volumes. You may notice that if you think all the way back to the first page that was handed out in August for the first set of notes, the heading was from Volume 2 of this particular work. We actually, even at the end of, before exams, at the end of the last trimester, we actually, and even then entered into the some of the material in the second volume, but now, for the second trimester, we'll enter into the third volume. So, we'll start with looking at the pontificate of what our author, the Pope, our author, gives the title of John the 19th. He does mention in a footnote of, for the reign of Pope, he lists as John the 18th, that the title of 17th goes to an anti-pope. But for whatever reason, the whole, at least according to the numbering he's giving here, the whole numbering system of the popes with the name John got thrown off as a result of that. So it might technically be Pope John the 18th, in fact, that we're looking at here, instead of the 19th. But sometimes that happens. So there's no guarantee that the titles of all the popes will always be in will always be kept track of perfectly as far as the numbers on the titles go. All right, so it's not as long as we know who we're talking about, of whom we are speaking, it's not all that important anyway. So, looking at, let's keep it simple, called Pope John the 19th, who reigned from, the Pope named John, who reigned from March of 1004 AD to July 18th of 1009 AD. To the period of this pontificate is assigned the important discovery of the gamut. That's an English word you don't hear too much anymore. It's used in different ways. You might hear the expression to run the gamut of something. That's to go through the whole thing. It's probably that expression is probably used by analogy to what we're looking at right here. Guido of Arezzo, you may have heard that name before. It's a famous name in the history of music theory. A Benedictine religious who thus fixed the principles of the grammar of music and foreshadowed the progress which the art was destined in its development to realize by the masterpieces of great composers. And so, yes, he invented those, at least the names of most of those syllables that are used to illustrate the musical scale, the notes of the musical scale. So, Guido called the 6 notes by the first syllables of the hymn appointed by the Church for the Vespers of St. John the Baptist. So, if you look at this hymn, it's a lot of the Vespers hymns were made to be much more complicated at a certain point. Now, if you read them or try to sing them, it's very difficult to understand what's being said, and that's because later on, and that, notice, in contrast to, for example, the hymns that we sing every day at Prime and Compline, those are quite simple. If you look at not only are they, most of them, easy to sing, but also the lyrics, the grammar of the lyrics and what's being said, the vocabulary and all the rest, it's all quite easy. Most of the Vespers hymns were made to be quite complicated. Not necessarily all of them, but most of them. Especially, if, say, the one we had just, must be 2 days ago now, anyway, this week, of the feast of the Basilica, the dedication of the Basilicas of Saints Peter and Paul. If you look at the Vespers hymn for that feast, it's quite complicated as far as what is being said here. And there are actually older versions of those hymns. If you look at I'm sure we have them around here somewhere, the Liber Antiphonarius that has a lot of chant notation in it. We used to use it to sing Vespers all the time. But if you look in that, you can find the older versions of those hymns, which they're still difficult, but they're much easier, significantly easier than the ones that are in the breviary today. And the reason is that they were at a certain point given to the Jesuits, who reworked them. And it was authorized, it had papal authorization, but they reworked them and made them much more difficult. So it seems that not all of them were modified that way. And the hymn for St. John the Baptist, this is still a fairly simple one, both with regard to the grammatical constructions and how to sing it. And it is indeed a very simple melody. If you look at it, it's a very simple melody amongst the melodies employed for Vespers hymns. And it was one that apparently this is really considered to be the Middle Ages by this point, a hymn that was well known by the generally Catholic population of Western Europe. And so the idea was, okay, use this hymn as this melody that you know as a reference point for different pitches. It would be something like today telling people to use row, row, row your boat or something. Think of that note that you sing when you sing the word row in that silly little song, for example. So if you think, okay, so I know what I sing when I sing, okay, now sing that note, sing row. Imagine that was something like that today. So he said, okay, sing, well, notice it's been changed since then. Instead of ut, now it's do. It's probably just easier to sing for musical reasons. It's easier to sing do than ut. But he could have said sing and ut or sing a re, and everybody would apparently knew this hymn, and so everybody like, okay, yes, I know what I know. I know the sound I make when I sing re sonare fibris, so I'll sing that. But changing perhaps the syllable being pronounced at that point, but that's the note we're singing at. They use it as a reference point. And so you have that ut queantloxis that's been changed to do since. I'm not sure what that comes from specifically, but in any case, that's been changed. But you still notice re sonare fibris, mira gestorum fabuli tuorum, solve polluti labi iratum. So it seems that maybe one or two more were added after that, but that's the basis of it all. So notice sol was, or so, you might hear it pronounced so, it was originally sol as in solve polluti. So that's an interesting thing to note, that that's what that came from. That's still used to this day. When you practice singing, the choir practices singing musical scales, for example, they'll use this, essentially the same system. That's been in place for not quite literally over 1,000 years. It's nothing better has been invented since, apparently. Probably would have been discovered by now. It's been a lot of time since then. So that's interesting. Very interesting to note that. And that was again by Guido of Arezzo that discovery was made. Okay, so pontificate of Sergius IV now. He ascended the throne of St. Peter on the 11th of October of 1009, contemporaneous with a disaster which sent a thrill through the whole of Christendom. And this was the Muslims destroying the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which had been once before burned by the Persians in the 7th century. So this is, notice, we'll see it later on, but this is the century of the beginning of the Crusades. They began in the 11th century. At the end, much later on, we're looking at the beginning. They began at the end of the 11th century. In fact, Jerusalem was taken back in the year 10, very famously in the year 1099. So it's an easy year to remember. The very last year of the 11th century, the year 1099. Notice we're looking here at the very beginning of that century, but still looking at that same century. And the reason for those, we'll see it, was because it was becoming increasingly difficult for Catholics to make pilgrimages to the Holy Land. That was the original reason for the calling of Crusades, to establish safe routes of pilgrimage through the Holy Land so that people can go and visit the sites of the life of our Lord, the earthly life of our Lord, without being molested by anybody for any reason. That was the original calling. That was the original reason for which that was called. The First Crusade, and generally speaking, considered to be the most successful crusade, the very first one. It actually resulted in the taking back of Jerusalem. So we'll see. It's all very interesting, the history of the Crusades and the Crusader states, because as the Crusaders went along and established themselves along the way, they did in fact establish Crusader states, which were interestingly, very interestingly, European states really in the Middle East, established for, yes, to definitely to provide safe passage for pilgrims, also as a kind of first line of defense against Islam, and they were always pushing forward, invading. It did eventually dominate that whole area to the point that it was until it was into the 20th century, Jerusalem was controlled by the Turkish Empire. That's a whole other story. But the Turks ended up in control of all of that. The Turkish Empire was it's this thing of the past now, and even long before its official end was in decline for a good long while. But it used to be quite extensive. It covered not only all of today the modern Republic of Turkey, but also extended all the way up to, I just want to take that map down off the wall. It's not too important right now, but an extent, if you can catch any glimpses of it, all the way to the borders of what is there, the Austrian Empire, at least to what the borders of the Austrian Empire, all the way down south towards Egypt. So the Turkish Empire was quite extensive, and much more extensive than the modern-day Republic of Turkey. The point is that whole area remained under Muslim control for a very long time. And of course, they continued to make incursions into Europe and to mount various attacks. That was one of them resulted in the Battle of Lepanto, for example, in the 16th century. But the point is, indeed, that was also a legitimate purpose for which the Crusades were waged, was to keep the forces of Islam at bay, which were truly an aggression against. No, again, what they did was aggressive against everybody, but specifically against Catholic Western Europe, which was indeed a collection of truly Catholic nations at that time. Not to say everything was perfect or problem-free, but the system was correct. The system was, we could even say, perfect. Everything was arranged as it ought to be. The problems were a result of the fact that human beings were still involved. And the effects of original sin will make themselves felt at every turn. But anyway, that's all looking ahead. But we're seeing the beginnings of that right now. The beginnings of the motives for which the Crusades were waged. Because there was no desire on the part of the church to exterminate Muslims or anything like that. There was no such thing. The church would like to see them converted. And the only reason for waging war is, the motive to make it safe for pilgrims to go when they were not able to. Okay, so it was taken for granted that this last outrage was due to the Jews in France, who wrote to the Caliph Hakim that unless he destroyed the shrine which drew so many Christian pilgrims, he would soon be despoiled of his domain. So that was what they thought. That may be true. I mean, the Jews were certainly interested in would like to have seen. They would not have been too upset, we'll say, to have seen that church destroyed for obvious reasons. But whether how true that was or not, it almost takes a second place to the fact that the bearer of the letter was arrested at Orleans in France, where he was recognized by a pilgrim who had traveled with him in Palestine. He confessed his crime and was condemned to be burned alive. So that says pretty strongly that he was guilty. That's a pretty obvious conclusion from that. But notice that what really results from that is that the account of their treachery soon spreads and reaches all parts of the world, which determined Christian princes to banish them altogether from their states. And this is something that you see time and again throughout history, is the Jews getting banished from various nations. And of course, that means that today Jews like to play the part of victim, and enough things have happened to them throughout history that they can pretty easily play the part of victim. Certainly, Hitler and the Nazis did in the 20th century that was a huge favor to them in a sense, because there's a certain aspect of truth. At least, I mean, what do you want to say about how many Jews they killed? That's a whole separate question. Definitely, the Nazis were anti-Jews and anti-Jewish in the wrong ways, and went about dealing with the Jews in all the wrong ways. That we can say for sure. The church does not oppose. The church does oppose the Jews, of course, but not on the basis of race, because in fact there is only one human race. They might use the term race to describe different groups of people within the human race, but the only correct way to talk about different races of people is in no other sense than just referring to really different groups within the family that is the human race. So the church obviously wants to see the Jews convert, just as anybody else. And when Jews convert, they're relatively very few throughout history have ever converted, at least since the very earliest centuries of the church. relatively very few Jews have ever converted. But when they do convert, and there are other instances of that, even if they are more the exception than the norm, still they're treated just like any other Catholic. They undergo baptism just as any unbaptized person would on their conversion, and then after that they're Catholic just like any other Catholic. And so the church is in no sense racist. And certainly not, there's no way you could legitimately say that of the church. No possible way. So, but the point, okay, back to the point that the Jews managed to get themselves banished from every place. Again, they like to play the victim because of that. But at the same time, though, as some today have pointed out, imagine if someone goes to all kinds of different restaurants in all different parts of the world and ends up getting kicked out of every single one of them, and it says, "Oh, all restaurant owners are bigoted against me." You might start thinking, well, maybe you should look at your own behavior. Just maybe that might have something to do with it. If all these different people everywhere are all finding you annoying and having the police come and take you away and having you trespassed from their establishments, maybe you're doing something annoying. just maybe. And yeah, the Jews have, that's just a fact. The Jews have made themselves nuisances to a lot of different people. That's just a fact, that a lot of people have found the Jews annoying for whatever reason, good reasons or bad. They have found them annoying and have wanted to get rid of them. It's just a fact. Like it or not. To hurl insults at anybody as a result of it or not, it's just a fact. Right, so all we're looking at here is that fact. And also the fact that the church has never, obviously, ever condoned any kind of persecution of the Jews in that sense. Obviously, the church has always said and always will say that the religion of the Jews, since their rejection of our Lord, is a false religion. And that is, of course, to say that they are guilty. If they do that, all those of them who do that culpably are guilty of very grave sin because of that. But the church, being moved as always by charity, wants their conversion. Doesn't want their extermination or anything like that. Does not desire any misery for them. So, every province shared the general horror at the crime. So, if that certainly you could say that was the general perception, and that the person who brought this about apparently wrote to this caliph who, for whatever reason, listened to that idea, and the blame got assigned, fairly or not, to the Jews in general. It seems that may be too much of a generalization. It's possible that one Jew do something very bad and others have nothing to do with it. There are people today who like to assign every evil thing that has ever happened on the planet to the Jews. That's also a bit of an exaggeration, but it pretty well describes their attitude. That some people assign everything bad that happens, must be the Jews. And that's also bad because, for one thing, they probably do it to a too great extent, assign many things to the Jews for which they may not actually be responsible. And that destroys just one more thing that leads to those who actually talk about things for which the Jews are responsible. And they are responsible for many evil things. They are not perfectly innocent lambs, however much they may want to be perceived as such. They have been guilty of bad things. There's no doubt of that. Most of all, the rejection of our Lord as the Messiah. They have been guilty of bad things. Certainly that. But the result of people who go overboard in blaming them for things results in the destruction of the credibility of anybody who says anything about them at all. And so it is a difficult thing to talk about. All this stuff is difficult in the sense of it's a very touchy thing, obviously. And it's also very delicate in the sense you have to make all the right distinctions at every step of the way. All these things, whether we're talking about the faults of human beings in general, that's always, it's faults or sins, whatever, they're defects, that's always a very touchy thing. Because it can, in fact, be the case that some set of defects very commonly occurs in one or another group of people. And it can also very easily happen that if you point that out, that'll be perceived as saying that, or you believe that such people are necessarily afflicted with that, or unavoidably, they can't free themselves from it, that they're somehow bound to that, or necessarily afflicted with it, something like that. And it can be easy to say things that are perceived that way, or even easy to slip into such beliefs. And that's not true. of course. Nobody is bound to commit any kind of sin or fault or be guilty of any specific defect, even if it does commonly occur. The point being, those are all the distinctions you have to make all the time. And it can be very difficult to do that correctly and clearly sometimes. It can be very difficult for people to remember all of those things. If you make them correctly when speaking about these things, it can be very difficult for people to keep all that straight. So prudence many times dictates avoiding such topics. But we do have to, here we're interested in just stating the truth about these things. So, indeed, the Jews have been guilty of bad things, not of every evil on the face of the earth, but of significant ones for sure. And people oftentimes go overboard in dealing with them. They can make themselves particularly irritating. The way people have reacted to them throughout time states that for sure, that they can make themselves a particular nuisance. Some were drowned, many perished by the sword or by other instruments of torture. Some were driven by despair to put an end to their own lives, while others sought baptism to escape death. And obviously that's not good either, because if that's purely the motive, just, okay, I want to avoid being hunted down and killed, so accept baptism, that's not a true conversion. So there are many evils involved in persecution. And by persecution, we mean treating somebody unfairly, in a way that is genuinely unfair. It can lead to things like that. And that was, we'll see it later on, that's why the Spanish Inquisition was founded. Because this kind of thing wasn't happening in Spain at the time, but what was happening was there was a definite social pressure on people to be Catholic in a Catholic nation. And so many Jews, because of that, underwent baptism, and there was a suspicion that maybe that was just due to social pressure. There was at least a suspicion. And keep in mind, the Spanish Inquisition did not go after Jews at all. It went after people who, at least on paper, were Catholics, but who were suspected to still be practicing Judaism behind closed doors, in hiding, so to speak. That's what the Spanish Inquisition went after. They may have expelled the Jews, but they didn't. The Spanish Inquisition, which was also, keep in mind, a state-run inquisition, there were clerics involved, as there always will be in a situation like that. One of church and state being united, there are clerics involved, and it was not an intrinsically evil thing. But ultimately, if you have to classify it as a civil or ecclesiastical institution, the Spanish Inquisition was a civil institution. That's just a fact, also. For better or worse, that's just also a fact. So, that's all getting ahead of ourselves, but there's a definite connection between all those things and what we're looking at here. So, this has furnished the enemies of the church with a new charge against her, as if she had aroused the popular indignation against the Jews, and must therefore answer for all the blood spilled in the course of these lamentable events. And that's obviously also unfair. The church has never condoned any such treatment of any group of people. And what's being described here comes across immediately as just murder. Severely unjust treatment and murder of people who, while they may not be perfectly innocent, definitely should not be treated like that. Keep in mind, it is possible for someone to, even in dealing with people who might themselves be seriously criminal in some way, it is still possible to sin gravely in dealing with those people. Think of somebody who's guilty of murder but who isn't convicted, but still a perception. Maybe there might even be certitude, but the person is not convicted for whatever reason. And someone in the victim's family decides to take matters into his own hands and shoot the murderer as he's being brought out of the courthouse or something. And that's also murder. That's also a grave sin. No one can take the law into his own hands. Even if the anger might make that seem like a course of action that has an appeal, it's still sinful. Capital punishment can be inflicted by the state sometimes, and the state's not guaranteed any kind of infallibility in inflicting it, but in principle, the state can do that and does so rightly. Presumption is definitely in favor of the state that it inflicts capital punishment. But it has to be done by the public authority, by the state that is invested by God, ultimately, by God himself, with the power to do that. So none of this, as is being described here, just has the what we would call today lynching. It's just going out and finding someone you're mad at and stringing them up, as it happened in the Wild West, to string someone up from a tree, or not even necessarily in the West, but that's, That's the first thing that comes to mind. Right? That's just murder. Right, so history, as the disinterested witnesses of the truth, cannot echo these slanderous charges. Obviously not against the church. Even if they were members of the church who were doing this, still, the church does not condone it. It can but record the tendency of prevailing sentiments which urged on the whole of Christendom against the Jews. And that's not utterly without reason. Because to be part of a false religion is a much worse thing. To be in the state of rejection of our Lord is a much worse thing than to charge very high interest rates, for example. That's just objectively true. It's a far graver sin, and they make no secret about their rejection of our Lord, Jews. Okay, so moving on, the pontificate of Benedict VIII, an arbitrary abuse of power, kept the paramount influence over the papal elections since the death of Sylvester II in the hands of the Count of Tusculum. The regular forms were still observed, but this foreign influence found means to act in spite of all canonical rules to the contrary. So it's not supposed to be the case, but still sometimes the civil power would influence or exercise influence over papal elections. So at the death of Sergius IV, the Count brought about the election of his own son under the name of Benedict VIII. An opposite faction thereupon crowned an anti-pope named Gregory, who commanded partisans sufficient number of partisans to force the lawful pontiff to quit Rome, where he could no longer have remained with any degree of safety. So this happens sometimes, that the pope has to flee Rome for his own safety. That's happened more than once. That was actually the motive, in a way, the motive of the Avignon papacy, as it's commonly referred to, because the Roman mob was so badly behaved that the Pope just wanted to get out of there. And that's legitimate in itself. The Pope can visit any place he wants, or set himself up. In principle, he can travel and spend some amount of time in any place. But he's really supposed to be in Rome. That's really where he belongs, in the sense that's where St. Peter established his see, and that's where the popes belong after. As we mentioned earlier this year, but you may have seen it, well, probably not at this point, as I recall. It's in the appendices, or towards the end, anyway, of the Ecclesia course, but it's actually debated amongst authors of what would happen, or could the see of St. Peter ever be moved to any city other than Rome. And de Groot's conclusion, as I recall, it's not the most important point in practice, definitely, but his conclusion was that it seems that if the city of Rome were to be completely destroyed, then it could be moved to some other city on a permanent basis. It would still be the see of Rome, in as much as it would still be the see of St. Peter. But for other reasons we've talked about, it's a very good thing that the Pope is in Rome, specifically. It was good in the time of the Roman Empire because, that was the place where, in a sense, the entire world was controlled from. So also, that was the place from which the entire church was controlled from. And also, the church was able to make use of, both before and after the conversion of the empire, make use of all of the infrastructure of the empire. It's physical infrastructure, and also at least after the conversion of the empire as well, the government, the system of government in place. And then after the fall of the Roman Empire, it's very good because in the nations that have risen since, most places, aside from Italy, have become pretty well-established nations of their own. But Italy was never the case. I mean, to this day, we've talked about it before, to this day, Italy is not really in any serious sense a unified nation. It might be on paper, but it's not really. It's still a very local place in the sense that people have. There is a certain nationality amongst Italians, but nobody thinks himself as an Italian nationalist. They're nationalistic towards their local areas. So it's very good that the Pope be in Rome, because there's no question of therefore being part of some other state, of being a puppet of any other power. And that was the perception that came about during the time when the popes were, generally speaking, residing in Avignon. No pope tried to officially move the Holy See to the seat of Avignon, but just the almost semi-permanent residence of the Pope himself and his court, the papal court in France, gave rise to a perception that, at least on the political level, that the papacy was just some kind of department of the French state, almost. And that's not a good thing, because everyone needs to clearly understand always that one thing that, yes, union of church and state is necessary, but that the church is not just a part of the state. The church is a divinely instituted society that is not as opposed to the state, which is not, no one state is divinely instituted. Even if the civil power is derived from God, the civil authority derives its power from God, still no state is divinely established. Certainly no state existing today is a divine institution. And no state, also, as distinct from the church, is guaranteed survival to the end of time, the way that the church is guaranteed that. And so there should not be any perception to any other effect. And so having the Pope in Rome is a very good thing for all those reasons. So the church should be free, the point being the church should be free of all political influence. All should be above such human considerations. So the Pope fled, it also happened that on another occasion that Pius IX had to flee Rome for his own safety. He had to dress as a simple priest and get away because there was serious danger. At one point, revolutionaries in Rome set up a cannon in St. Peter's Square and shot a bishop dead at his window. That happened in the 19th century, so Pius IX had to make an escape. So that's all for later sections of church history, which are also very interesting, but for later. So at this point, in the early 11th century, the Pope flees to Saxony, to Pölten in Saxony, where St. Henry II was celebrating the Christmas festival. So the Holy Roman Emperor Henry II, obviously canonized by the Church, was, we'll see some details of his life. He appeared before the King of Germany, the attire befitting his dignity, and gave a touching account of all the outrages he had suffered from his rebellious subjects. St. Henry promised his aid to the Vicar of Christ and would have set out at once for Rome had he not been detained for a attempt to put down a fearful revolt. So, if you have a copy of the Darras book, you have all the details of that, which we won't enter into here. But having once restored quiet at home, he was enabled to accompany the Pope to Italy, and his approach sufficed to recall the fractious to their duty. So, in other words, everybody sat up straighter as the emperor approached with his forces. Benedict VIII returned to Rome, where his faithful subjects, now freed from the power of the anti-pope, received him with transports of joy, and Henry II likewise made his triumphal entry on the 14th of February, 1014. So, as is actually fitting, the Pope and the Emperor entered together, showing us a strong alliance between the two, as there ought to be, Rome in 1014. So the Sovereign Pontiff mediated the restoration in favor of the Holy King of the imperial power extinct since the death of Otto III. So remember, the Holy Roman Empire still in theory extends to all of the domains of the old Western Roman Empire, even if many emperors have not been able to, either unable or unwilling to actually take care of those areas. So we'll see eventually the Holy Roman Empire, such as it was, came to be pretty well confined to just Germany. And even then, the position was more one of influence than of real political control. So Henry II walked to St. Peter's Church, wearing the royal crown. So this also, just for the record, is not the St. Peter's Basilica that we know today. This was an earlier, certainly a basilica, but a major church anyway, but definitely if not the one today. That was built later. It was rebuilt at a certain point to be nicer. So St. Henry II walked into St. Peter's Church wearing the royal crown. He was accompanied by his queen, St. Cunegunda, surrounded by 12 senators. So you have the details of the ceremony, which are very good, very edifying, of course. Two saints, one Pope Saint crowning an Emperor Saint. That's going to be an edifying scene. It wouldn't have been canonized had it not been. So Benedict VIII crowned and anointed Henry II Emperor. So we've been calling him Emperor. This is his official crowning. The new Emperor confirmed all the grants made by the church to the church by Charlemagne and the Ottos, and decreed at the same time that the election of the pontiff should be freely carried on by the Roman clergy and people, provided the consecration took place before the imperial envoys, as decreed by Eugenius IV and Leo IV. So the people were henceforth excluded from a voice in the election, which was reserved to the clergy alone. So you notice that, at one time, those who were allowed to vote in a papal election, that was a wider range of people allowed in. But what that indicates is that it really is the election of the Pope is meant to manifest the choice of the entire church in the person of the Pope. And that's something that all the authors talk about, that the universal peaceful acceptance of the Pope is an infallible sign. They're very strong in talking about that it's an infallible sign that the Pope, that their current reigning Pope is actually, when there is one, is actually a legitimate, truly legitimate Pope. Some even go so far as to say that it's a guarantee also that he was validly baptized, validly ordained a priest, validly consecrated a bishop, and some even say it's de fide, that he's truly the Pope. Now, not all of them say that, and you could make a case against those notions, it seems to me, but putting all that aside, what is certain in such a case is that he is a legitimate reigning Pope. And what degree of certitude should technically be assigned to it is almost another question, not entirely, but that's really a whole another consideration in a sense. Because what is certain is that he is actually the reigning Pope. And again, we say it's just all that is true. You just have to understand that includes the acceptance of the Pope himself as Pope. That he has to accept the papal authority and actually intend to possess and exercise it with all the right intentions. I say to actually intend the good of the church. And that is the difference between a real Pope and today's pretenders. It's ultimately with their own acceptance or lack thereof of the papacy. Despite what they say, they do not intend to truly be popes. All right, so the stipulations in favor of the pontifical elections were respected so long as the emperors remained on the spot to enforce them, for in these lawless ages a host of petty tyrants contended for power in Rome, and so sought to rule by force. All right, so before departing, the Pope and St. Henry II discussed a question of liturgy. So notice this, we're coming back to the Filioque, and notice also how our author frames it, and he frames it correctly, that this is a question of the liturgy. Not a question of doctrine or of dogma. That point is amply settled. There is no question whatsoever about whether the Holy Ghost proceeds from the Father and the Son. He most definitely does, and it would be heresy, clearly, to say anything else. No question about that whatsoever. What we're talking about here is a question of sacred liturgy. And what we're having, don't look at the details of it, and speaking of the discussion on the Filioque, we remarked that the custom of singing the creed at Mass had not been introduced into the Roman Church. The emperor was accustomed to hear it chanted, since the usage had passed over from the churches of France and Spain to those of Germany. He accordingly asked the Pope why Rome did not adopt the custom. So you may remember that Charlemagne brought this up with the Pope, that was living at his time, and said that was advised to suppress it, to suppress the custom. Not saying that it was unorthodox, most definitely not that, but that it might cause trouble elsewhere if you continue doing that, as in fact it did. But it wasn't stopped, just continued. You may remember that advice was effectively not necessarily ignored by Charlemagne himself, but when you're dealing with France, they very much like their way of doing things, and that's true. The French are very attached to their own way of doing things. People, generally speaking, tend to be, but the French are particularly fierce about that. And so they clearly didn't give it up. Continued and in fact spread the practice of singing Filioque. And you have to remember at the time that the strict central control, relatively speaking strict, central control by the Holy See of all questions of the sacred liturgy, that's a relatively recent thing. Relatively so. As in, St. Pius V only promulgated the Tridentine Missal in the 16th century, kind of recent control. That's how relatively recent it is that there would be universally in principle observed Roman Missal everywhere in the church. This is the Missal used in the city of Rome itself, and so everybody is supposed to use that. Or at least one that's in. Maybe some additions for local customs that are approved, but ultimately everybody is using the same thing. That's why you may see if you look at missals that are published. See, we have Benzinger Brothers Missals, which was an American publisher, If you look at old breviaries, old as in prior to Vatican II, breviaries or missals, even other books as well, you'll notice that the Benziger brothers, they had all these different publishing houses in all these different cities throughout the United States. Even so, when they did that, there still is, you may notice if you look at the title page of the missal, a stamp that certifies that this is in conformity to the typical edition. That is to say, this missal is in conformity in every way that it must be to the missal that is used in the city of Rome itself. I see that definitely in the, it's usually in Latin, or it should be in Latin, but you see that whether it's a Benziger Brothers missal that's published in the U.S. or a Pustet missal published in Germany or any other approved place, it's all in accordance with the typical edition, as it's called. So having that kind of an arrangement is a relatively recent thing. Everything always, it's not to say that the Pope acquired some new authority or something like that. No, the Holy See always had that authority. It's just that over time, as more abuses crept in and the numbers of members of the church increased and so on and so forth, it became more and more necessary due to a host of different factors for the Holy See to exercise its authority more directly and to have everything officially centralized in Rome, controlled by the Pope himself and the Sacred Congregation of Rites. That's why if you ever have an SRC, Sacra Rituum Congregatio, the Sacred Congregation of Rites, that puts out a decree on something, that is it. The only thing that could overturn that is a subsequent decree or decision of the Pope himself. But that is to be taken as coming from the Pope himself. That's why authors, when they're being helpful at least, as for example does O'Connell, the author whom we use instead when you, as a deacon, you first learn how to say Mass, you consult that book a lot. He gives every time that there's something that absolutely has to be done a certain way, he gives a rubric of the Missal or an SRC decree. And he says himself that he does that so that the reader can easily tell what is truly strictly required by the laws of the church versus what is an explanation given by authors. Because not every little thing absolutely imaginable has been nailed down. A lot of things have been, but not every imaginable thing. And sometimes that drives a little bit crazy. What do you do? Sometimes things seem to slip through the cracks. What do you do on this or that? Nobody describes it. Almost left guessing sometimes. And you make an educated guess, but sometimes that's all you can do. Just figure out what is the most likely thing that is supposed to be done here or there. And that's not even necessarily in saying Low Mass, but in any ceremony you might be trying to figure out. Because now, not everything was nailed down completely. That's perhaps a project for the next true Pope to do, is to carry out, is to put together the ultimate Ceremoniale Romanum that nails down every little thing, but there's nothing left to the imagination at all. But you need a real Pope to do that. So hopefully, but we need a new real Pope to do that. Okay, so what we're talking about here is a question of the sacred liturgy, which you notice the Emperor is consulting the Pope on this. The Church of Rome, replied Benedict, having never fallen into any heresy, has no need of this solemn profession of her faith. You may notice that in the Apostles' Creed, you don't find the word filioque. Because it wasn't. Typically, this happens, you find this throughout the history of the Church, things get defined, or formularies of faith make things more explicit in response to some heresy or some controversy. Not necessarily, but very often. So there are many times that there may not be a need to define something because nobody ever denied it. So there's never been a definition, or whether it can be defined is another thing, but for example, there's never been a definition of baptism of blood and baptism of desire because prior to the 20th century, nobody really ever denied that. You might find some occasional person who called it into question, but nobody pertinaciously denied it. It was just not a problem in the past. So, it's not always necessary to have everything explicitly stated. Even if everyone who has the virtue of faith always does believe everything contained in divine revelation, at least implicitly. At least. Not necessarily even realizing everything that's contained in it. But still, everybody has to believe everything that is in fact contained in divine revelation. That's why very commonly people they find different formulas for making acts of faith. I believe these and all the truths which the Holy Catholic Church teaches. That's very commonly stated in acts of faith that you find. And indeed, that is what everyone who has the virtue of faith does believe. Not necessarily doesn't say I explicitly see every single doctrine ever presented by the Church in all its detail. Just I believe all the things that the Holy Catholic Church teaches because God has revealed them, who can neither deceive nor be deceived, and that sums it up very nicely. All right, so notice here, still the Sovereign Pontiff, after a mature examination of the question, and with a view to cement by a lasting monument the peace existing between the Roman and Greek churches, which would be better phrased by saying the fact that the Holy See has jurisdiction everywhere, whether that be in Rome, Italy, or in the Greek Empire, ordered that the symbol of Constantinople should thenceforth be sung in Rome, which contains the Filioque. So, let's see. I actually have to look at it, but probably it does. Okay, so Cardinal Lambertini, and Cardinal Lambertini is better. He lived much, much later than this time we're looking at, but he is better known by another title. Does anybody happen to know what that is? Lambertini. Better known as Pope Benedict XIV. But he's cited here as Cardinal Lambertini because he did, in fact, write works as a private theologian. So, in that sense, so not everything ever attributed to Benedict XIV is a magisterial statement. Some of it is from his works as a theologian, which still has authority, let's make no mistake there. But the authority of no theologian, however learned and authoritative he might be, can never obviously come close to the authority of the Roman Pontiff. So just keep that in mind. Many times you hear Pope Benedict XIV says this or that, and he said many good things. I mean, he was in fact very personally learned. There's no question of that. So anything he says, even as a private theologian, carries significant weight. Not everything, though, that he said is a magisterial pronouncement. Just something to keep in mind. So, for clarity here, our author refers to him as Cardinal Lambertini. Observes on this subject that there are 4 creeds adopted by the Catholic Church. The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene, composed in 325, that's sung at Mass, the Constantinopolitan, and the Quicumque, known as the Athanasian Creed, which is recited at the Office of Prime. So, because it starts with the word Quicumque vult salvos esse. And you have to look at it. Obviously, the Nicene Creed contains the Filioque. You'd have to look at the Constantinopolitan to see, which it seems to, but you have to look at it. And the Athanasian Creed is by far the longest, obviously, of the ones that are regularly used in the Church. So that's why if you ever see it, look at the Ordo for Prime on some Sundays, you see the Quicumque. That's to indicate that the Athanasian Creed is to be sung, or as the case might be, recited on that day. Which is, you may know already, but Trinity Sunday, obviously, this is one of those days. And then other Sundays are all the Sundays in green, so the regular semi-double Sundays after Epiphany and after Pentecost, on which there is no double office commemorated. So if a double office that's reduced to a commemoration on that Sunday, then you don't sing the Athanasian Creed. So if you have most regular saints' feasts, so many of them anyway, are doubles. So if a double, what would be a double feast falls on a Sunday, then you don't have the Athanasian Creed. But sometimes you do. All right, so Quicumque vult salvos esse, starts with that. All right, so the Holy Emperor caused a council to be convoked at Seligenstadt, some of whose canons are interesting as they furnish some curious details on the ecclesiastical matters and discipline of the 11th century. So certain things do develop in the history of the Church. Doctrine does in a good sense, in an orthodox sense, in as much as it becomes clearer over time. Modernists like to say that, and it develops and evolves, by which they mean to say that it changes into something else substantially, and that's heresy. In fact, condemned by St. Pius X. Even doctrine develops in the sense of becoming more clearly stated, and perhaps better phrased even over time, but always remaining essentially the same. As you've probably seen that already in De Revelatione, that statement that the Church, the manner of the teaching of the Church is nove sed non nova, in a new way. Nove, the adverb of novus, so newly, in a new way, sed non nova, not new things. an adjective in that case being used as a substantive in a new way, but not new things. And if you think about it, the modernists do the opposite. They introduce heresies, but using the same terms that the church uses, by gutting them of their meaning. So if you see that, yes, modernism is one of the ways in which they try to maintain their cover, so to speak. Just using terms that you recognize, but they mean different things by them. So then, in a sense, modernists do the opposite of nove sed non nova. But among other things that can change are, yes, exactly, customs and discipline of the church. And that indicates the human side of things in the church, that, yes, the disciplines of the church are protected by infallibility. Anything that's approved to be done everywhere in the church cannot possibly be sinful. It doesn't mean it's necessarily the very best thing, but it cannot possibly be sinful. But as we indicated, it's possible that it be improved upon. You can figure out something better. For example, one time, popes required that the chalices used at Mass be made of glass or crystal because it looks nice. It's ornate. But then they realized, well, actually, that shatters pretty easily. So don't do that anymore. So things can develop. Things can change like that. Okay, we'll continue with that next time. Domine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen, sub tuum presidium confugimus sancta Dei Genitrix, nostras deprecationes et despicias in necessitatibus, seracuriclis cunctis libera nos semper, Virgo gloriosa et benedicta.
Amen.
Domine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen.